is Cameron deliberately walking away from Thatcherism just because he wanted to appease the voters, or is he pursuing his own political goals in order to get what he wanted to achieve, like the EU referendum?
Did he mean it? Is it in a sense? So it's a great question. I mean, I think modernization as a concept
Mhm.
is sort of widely misunderstood and misused. I mean, it's like many concepts in British politics that are misunderstood and misused, or people become symbols for things that they weren't. So I'll give you one example. We still talk today about one nation conservatives,
Mhm.
um, um, which obviously a phrase that comes from Disraeli. Now, Disraeli makes his name as a radical right wing um, uh, member of the Tory party who
Mhm.
opposed free trade and stood for kind of aristocracy and all the rest. He was a radical. He was a
Mhm.
he was a radical performer uh, who was deeply distrusted by the Conservative Party. Um, and was part of groups. There was a kind of overlap in some strange sense with kind of Eurosceptics. Member of a group called Young England. These are like
Oh, yeah.
young English radicals.
Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
that's kind of diverting slightly of the point. But modernization is a um, was a tool that was a word used by both the Blairites and the Cameroons. Um, and it meant for the different parties something quite similar, which was a form of taking the party away from its obsessions toward where the voters were. But it also had other ramifications. So if you think about Tony Blair,
Mhm.
for instance, before I get onto Cameron, Tony Blair thought of modernization as moving away from old Labour
Mhm.
and moving towards a new Labour, which was more in tune with Middle England.
Mhm.
Now, part of that was, as he entered 1997, a constant state of reassurance towards Middle England, conservative Middle England, over Europe. So he took out articles in the Sun saying how much he loved the pound and the feel of it and the Queen's
Mhm.
head and all of this stuff. Um, and it comes up against, contradicts a second idea he has about modernization, which is the Hugo Young idea of modernization, which is modernity in some senses is Europe. Europe
Mhm.
modernity and Britain, nationalistic, inward looking Britain is backward looking.
Mhm.
Modernity is Europe. But the two kind of come into conflict because he's seeking through modernization to reassure a country that remains quite Eurosceptic. And so he makes promises to Britain that will make it harder for him to achieve the modernization that he fully believes in. So he makes a promise to that before we enter the euro, the single currency, you will have to have a referendum. That is a barrier he is never able to cross. He wants to, throughout his entire time as prime minister, he wants to be able to go into the single currency. He can't. Um,
Mhm.
now, modernization in the Conservative Party
Mhm.
is a story that is often overlooked. It comes from the right of the Conservative Party. The Thatcherite, Eurosceptic right are the ones who lead the modernization of the party. They are some of the most radical uh, libertarian conservative students in the 1980s who resent what they see as the kind of upper class, aristocratic, wet conservatives who are stopping Margaret Thatcher doing what she wants. And they see themselves as these radical modernizers. and they are radicalized further by Margaret Thatcher's removal and what they perceive as their victory, their ideological victory in the Cold War. What they do in 1997 and their defeat is to rage against the party that is obsessing over things that they don't care about, sort of conservative social values. And they seek to modernize the Conservative by making it more socially liberal. But if you look at the characters who are absolutely involved from the beginning, and it revolves around a think tank called Policy Exchange, which is still very influential today, they are avowedly Eurosceptic figures. And they work hand in hand to maintain a kind of Thatcherite Euroscepticism with a social liberalism. And Cameron has to operate in this era. And in the book, you'll see a moment where just to win the nomination for the Conservative Party to become MP in the Cotswolds, where he becomes an MP, he has to explicitly say that he is a Eurosceptic and that he does not believe in further giving away further powers to Europe.
Mm-hmm.
So right from the very beginning of this story of conservative modernization is a tension, and it's a pull towards Euroscepticism that you see. It's there from the beginning, and as I say, when in the opening remarks, I talked about currents under the surface. If you look at the Parliament from 97 through to 2016, what you will see, although you see these great Labour victories, you will see a Conservative Party that becomes steadily more and more Eurosceptic over that entire period.
The current debate seems to split very helpfully the single market issue from EU membership. Even on the day of the referendum and in all the polling in July, August, September till Christmas 2016, the single market held more respect among the British public than any political party by some very considerable margin. All that polling began to cease in 2017-18 as it got blurred into this general Brexit warfare. But the British public, on the day they voted, knew A, they wished to leave on a narrow margin, the EU, but B, they quite definitely, by a very large margin, wished to remain in the single market. And the polling stayed consistent on that. How do you think that plays out going forward? Has that respect been lost? Or has it just not been brought to the surface? Or will it play in if we come to citizens' assemblies and some kind of voting process to ask the public again, would you like to join the single market?
So I think it's incredibly complicated, isn't it? Because when you think back to the terminology that we would use in British politics, I was trying to track down actually the moment we started talking about Eurosceptics. And it's not until really quite late. It was a term that was only used, I think, beginning in around 94, 95. But the term that most people used for what we all now just refer to as the EU or Europe, in quotes, was the common market. This was a phrase right from 1975 through to the formation of the EU in Maastricht. It was the common market was the common parlance for what Europe was. Or the EEC, but I think when you read back the newspapers, when I went back and read through the newspapers, the common market was a common way of describing it. And that thing I mentioned about Hugo Young's book and the blessed plot, and of course the blessed plot is a play on words. It's a part of a Shakespeare soliloquy about this, sceptred isle set between the Silver Sea and this, royal throne of kings, and all of that kind of patriotic language, envisaging England as this, sort of perfect realm. It's that, but he's playing with the word plot it's a plot of land, but it was also a kind of plot, as Hugo Young put it, as I say, this incredibly pro-European journalist. It was a plot because it was never just a common market. It was never the purpose. You go back to the beginning, Jean Monnet and the European leaders, they are absolutely explicit that it's about the sharing of sovereignty over core, initially, war-making assets, coal and steel, and then beyond that, it's a noble project to create a new sovereignty, a new federal institution, and an identity that goes with that, a kind of sense of belonging to Europe. And if you go and read like the Heath speeches, for instance, they're by far our most pro-European prime minister. In some senses, I think he's perhaps our most radical prime minister, more radical than Thatcher in terms of he's the one that really breaks with what almost all British prime ministers try to do, which is try to have it all and to have a kind of relationship balance between the United States and Europe. Whereas Heath is explicit that we should choose Europe. He's the only one who makes that case. And he's quite critical of the idea of thinking about Europe as a single market. He is saying it's not a market. It's not an open free trading market. It is a community, he says in House of Commons. It's a community of members. We share, we put a border, but we share rules. We make the rules together. And we share a common identity, a civilization, culture, values, and all the rest. That's his vision of it. And I think there is a danger here in this position that we're entering into on the common market, that the common market is, the single market comes around in 1986, the Single European Act. And Jacques Delors and the Europeans in Brussels are quite worried about it, in a sense.
It feels as though the language you're using doesn't fit where we are now, and in fact wasn't on the 23rd of June 2016. On that day, the British public were mathematically Eurosceptic, but on that day, they were by a large margin pro-single market. They had the sophistication then, and through all the polling since then, to know the difference. They could be skeptic about the currency, skeptic about a federal situation, but strongly pro the single market, which I think they are aware is basically a trading market. They were even aware by July, by a huge majority, they would prefer to have access to the single market and accept the migrant flow. And that was then, let alone now.
You're right to say that they are, people can hold those two views together. That's perfectly true and valid. I don't think it will work personally. I don't think it's a sustainable long-term position for the United Kingdom to be in a market in which rules are set elsewhere. I think it's I can completely understand the trade-off when you could say that the costs of leaving are too great and therefore it's better to be in than to be out. But I think the logic of being in the single market is to be in the EU.
That's in your view?
Yeah. In my view, the logic of being in the single market is to be in the EU so that you can have some say over the rules that will apply.
But to a market practitioner, they want to be in the single market so you can export into the single market the goods you make. And the rest of it is largely noise in a way. They want to export their goods and thereby gain an investment flow into their business inside the UK, whereas at the moment, they need to move that business outside the UK. I think the public can see that.
But what's the benefit then of not being in the EU?
It avoids a lot of issues. We're not in the currency. We don't have to talk about Schengen. We want to be in a market so that a business can remain here, attract investment, and sell its goods without interruption, not just to the European single market, but to the American market without needing to apply the standards that the American market may stipulate. I think they see it as a market to be in, and the rest, they are happy to have different views or no views or conflicting views. But I think my guess would be they want to be, as they expressed in all that polling, they know being in the market matters.
I'm not denying the case for being in the market or anything. To me, the point about Europe from the beginning, though, has not been primarily one of a market. It's been one of a political project, which is more important, more profound, and has a sort of a more profound goal at its heart. Now, it ends up in a single market. That is one of the things that is brought in. But there are other things that are there. The single the trade block. The customs union. That is a part of it. The travel zone.
Yes.
All of it is part of it, but it's an expression of an idea, a political idea that is the sharing of sovereignty for a collective part of the world that shares values and history, and it comes together and it's stronger together and it's less likely to end in war. All of that is the principles that start and run through the European project. And to me, Britain has always thought, in a sense, that it could just pick the market bit of that. It thought that because you talked about Schengen and you talked about the currency. We were inside the EU and we're not in Schengen and we're not in the currency. We've always thought that
we don't buy into some of those ideals.
Yes, but that has led to the very problem that led to the Brexit referendum. The reason David Cameron called that referendum was because he started, along with other things, desperate political calculations to see off UKIP and the rest, Nigel Farage. But there was a strategic concern that he had, which was that outside of the single currency, but inside the single market, he feared that Britain would lose the ability to set the rules over which the British economy, because the single currency bloc would come together as a single bloc with certain interests that were existential during the Eurozone crisis, and they would come together and set the rules and they would apply them to Britain. And the principal fear that he had that they would apply them to the City of London and that they would do so in a way that benefited the Eurozone and not Britain. Now, right or wrong, whether that's a reasonable concern or not, that was a concern that absolutely drove him. And so even if you go inside the inside the EU and you have a seat at the table, if you're not at the heart with everybody else in the single currency, you will have that fear, and you'll have that fear in spades if you're outside the EU and you don't have a seat at the table. And that is why Tony Blair wanted to be in the single currency so desperately, because he wanted the same power and influence as Germany and France, and he feared that we would never get it if we were outside.
You referenced there the polling about the single market. I don't remember seeing that at the time, around the time of the referendum, but do you have references, or can you remember who was doing the polling about that, about the level of interest in the single market being greater than sort of Euroscepticism?
The polling was, the Evening Standard used to run them regularly. There was polling by Comres, by ORB. I'm looking at the summary I used to prepare in papers I did in July, August, September, October. And there were many. It's on the BBC website of that time. There was no challenge to it. But there was no referendum separately.
Keir Starmer has been boasting about he's signing trade deals with, I say, South Korea, with Australia, even with Donald Trump. I mean, how is this going to play out? Like, EU keeps, having signing these or forming a cause with these big trade blocs, and Britain somehow is sort of staying away and still trying to do this individual trade deals with individual countries? That's my question.
One of the themes that runs through the book is the kind of, like I was saying earlier, the kind of chaos and the contingency of history, the importance of events, of decisions that we don't realize are important at the time, but become really important in history because of unintended consequences of, I'll give you an example. Black Wednesday in 1992 was really the moment that kind of turbocharged Euroscepticism. It's the moment where the Thatcherites believed that they were proved right, and that they then sort of doubled down in their opposition to John Major, and Margaret Thatcher causes trouble from the House of Lords. Was she on the backbenches then? Yeah, from the House of Lords post the election, I think. And if you think about what happened after 1992, a new consensus formed entirely by accident. Nobody sort of purposely led Britain into this position, but it just emerged as a policy. This was not the Foreign Office policy. This was not Treasury policy. But Britain ended up in a situation where it was inside the single market and inside the EU, but no longer even trying to hold the value of the pound stable against the European currencies en route to joining a single currency. Now, that had been foreign office policy and treasury policy, that it was both a way to hold down inflation, to tie the pound to the Deutschmark, and the necessary precursor to join the single currency, which was necessary to protect British influence in the EU, and to have influence over what the future of the single currency would look like. That crashed in 1992, and a new policy emerged, which held all the way until Brexit, effectively, inside the single market, but outside the single currency, with no route back in, it seemed. That's just an example of how Britain kind of stumbles from one position to the next. It kind of muddles through history with no obvious kind of direction, or no clarity of direction, no real leadership in a sense. And I'd give one example that you've highlighted, the diverging trade paths of the EU and Britain. Now, one major reason why Britain will struggle to join a customs union with the EU is because it's already signed trade deals with the United States and China, which mean there are different trade policies now in place. And you speak to people in Number 10, and they will make this very clear that this is a fundamental barrier to a customs union. And underneath that decision is a secondary decision, which will have massive impacts on our ability or likelihood of rejoining the single market. And that is that this government has made the calculation that it should get close to the United States on all matters of tech regulation, because it sees that as the future of British prosperity, to effectively align with American big tech, so that we can get inward investment from the big technology companies, and then to move closer to Europe on matters of food, farming, and industrial production, where geography clearly matters intensely, as the previous questioners has correctly pointed out, cost of business and the rest. But the very act of aligning your policy, your regulations with an economic bloc that's not the EU, with the US, and with the EU moving in a different direction, means that it becomes that is a fundamental shift in British policy, which will have consequences for foreign policy and long-term economic policy and our long-term relationship with Europe. And none of this has really much public debate. Big votes in the House of Commons, major debates, just like there's no major debate that this was settled policy that we would be outside the ERM after 1992. It happens. We stumble into it. We muddle through from one small decision to the next that have these outsized consequences. And in part, my argument would be back to the argument about trade, single markets and the rest, largely because people think that these things are sort of benign deals about inward investment and trading. And actually they have big political consequences. That means it's going to be harder for us to get closer to the EU again or to re-enter because we've bet on the United States.